Welcome to Liberalism in Question. My name's Rob Forsyth, and in this series from the Centre for Independent Studies, we look at liberalism today, its threats, its questions, its value, where it's going in its various forms. And my guest today is Jason Riley from the Wall Street Journal. Welcome. Jason, you've been writing columns since 1994 and have written many books, but I notice that you constantly criticise liberals.
Yes.
What does liberalism mean in America? Because I think it means something different to what I meant in Australia.
It does. In fact, not just something different, it probably means something close to the opposite of how you use the term. So when we discuss liberals in America, what we're referencing is what you would call the Labour Party here in Australia. So that's the difference. We're talking about different views of the role of government. And a liberal in America is someone who believes in a large role for the government to play in all kinds of matters in the lives of citizens, and so large taxes, large welfare state, and on downward from there.
Whereas I'm here, we use the term to mean almost the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Classical liberalism, while it's seeing an important role for government, is very interested in the society itself without government creating wealth, organising itself, and so forth.
Right.
Do you know why the words mean so different? How'd that come from?
Well,
because it's bizarre to me that they could mean exact opposites.
The use of the word liberal has changed over the decades in America. The people who call themselves liberal today, and to some extent call themselves progressives, used to call themselves progressives in the first part of the 20th century exclusively. If you go back to American presidents in the early 1900s, like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, they were known as progressives. And that is a term that fell out of favor after the rise of the eugenics movement and culminating in Nazism. That had a taint to it, progressives. And so they stopped calling themselves that and started calling themselves liberals. And that is stuck for a time being. Today, some of them, the more extreme liberals, call themselves progressives again, now that the term has lost some of its taint. Well, so today, the terms progressive and liberal are used almost interchangeably.
Well, what do actual liberals call themselves?
Well, in America, they call themselves conservatives. And the Republican Party is known as the more conservative party, as opposed to the Democratic Party, which is known as the more liberal party. Among conservatives, you also have a libertarian wing. So not all conservatives see things exactly the same way, but the libertarians and the conservatives are both what we would call on the political right in America, as opposed to the political left.
One can draw a distinction between, in our language, between conservative and liberal. They're often connected, but in fact, I think for some, like Hayek, said he was not a conservative very strongly. Don't be a conservative. Yeah. Are there classical liberal conservatives and other kind of conservatives? That is, those who believe in big government, or social conservatism.
Sure. There are conservatives, and we're actually having a debate about this in America right now, particularly in the post-Trump era that we're in. I mean, some people say it's not quite post-Trump era; it's still the Trump era, and there's an argument for that. But maybe that's a different conversation.
We will see.
But there is a sort of big government conservative movement in America.
What I was thinking of, yes.
And Trump would I think be part of that movement, and that would be quite distinct from the classical liberal that you're discussing, who wants to minimize the role of government in the lives of everyday people. Someone more in the tradition of an Adam Smith or a John Stuart Mill or David Ricardo, sort of a more free market conservative. Whereas you do have conservatives who want to use government to achieve more conservative social
goals,
policies.
Yes, like
and so, yes, you do have some tension there.
I notice you're often called a black conservative, as though there's something unusual. I've never heard someone called, he's a white conservative.
Right.
Can you talk about the race issue here? And
Sure. Historically, at least for the past 5 or 6 decades in America, black Americans have typically been on the left, associated with liberalism. And so a black conservative is not very common in America, or at least black conservatives who identify as such are not very common.
Well,
in other words, I think there's a strong case to be made that there are plenty of black Americans who share conservative views, but don't self-identify as a conservative. And that has to do with sort of intra-racial distinctions among black Americans themselves, and whether or not it's appropriate to identify as a conservative, given the history of the conservative movement in America with regard to race relations.
Well, let me ask that. Am I not right that it was federal government intervention that helped really break the back of the Jim Crow laws in the South? And in fact, government, I mean, you may say government was the problem.
that was where I was going to go with that.
Please go. Yes.
Yes. I think that was the best thing the federal government ever did, was to break the back of Jim Crow, particularly in the South. But as you said, they were trying to clean up their own mess. I mean, slavery was a federal government program. So Jim Crow, which came out of slavery, which was a system of apartheid in America, that treated blacks differently from whites under our legal system of government, that too was a government program. So the idea that the government would stop doing that, I think, is a very good thing. But it is very much them cleaning up their own mess. Where the problem has come in with the role of government beyond that is I think they've done much more harm than good in trying to produce equal outcomes among blacks and whites, which is a lofty goal, something we'd all like to see. But I think the government is ill-suited to do those things. I think the government's the better role for the government is to get out of the way, to make sure that there's a level playing field, to create equal opportunity, and then it will be up to individual groups to take advantage of those opportunities. Instead, what we've seen is a much more interventionalist government trying to do more than I think it's really capable of doing with respect to helping underprivileged minorities.
I mean, this is the great issue about equality and liberalism. Is it to be equal opportunity, which may still require some intervention too, or is it going to be equal outcomes? Yeah. And you're saying equal outcomes is not a good aim.
Well, I think equal outcomes are utopian. I don't see.
That is, they can't be achieved. You're saying.
Correct. I mean, where have they been achieved? Would be my question. Where do you find? Can you point to a society today, yesterday, here in Australia, in America, anywhere around the world, down through history, where you see this evenness of outcomes that is held up as something that is attainable? And not only that, we are told by people who are pursuing it that where we don't see equal outcomes, something nefarious must be going on. Something fishy must be going on if we don't have groups represented proportionately in terms of educational attainment, in terms of involvement with the criminal justice system, in terms of income levels, in terms of educational achievement, and on and on and on. Yet nowhere down through history do you find this racial balance or ethnic balance in outcomes that they're holding up as the norm. And so I think, again, we need to be realistic about our goals here. And I think when it comes to government policy, the most that we can hope for is to be treated equally under the law. And then it will be up to various groups to take advantage of the opportunities laid out under the rule of law.
So you're saying inequality is natural?
I think that is the lesson of history, that yes, inequality is natural. Groups have progressed, they have retrogressed. It's not as if a group's socioeconomic status is set in stone. That's not what I'm saying. Just because a group may be lagging in this category or that category doesn't mean they will always be lagging. But what I'm saying is that you don't see this evenness of outcome that is held up as the norm by those on the left anywhere in society down through history. And I'm of the opinion that any expectation that we would have such a thing is in fact utopian.
Jason, do you think there are sometimes there is, if not nefarious, there's an inappropriate inequality of outcome? That is, there are actually things holding people back which shouldn't be holding them back, or is it always all inequality is basically a matter of the way people? Well, is the responsibility of people themselves, or is society sometimes still to blame, to put it that way?
Well, different groups, come out of different cultures, different behaviors, different attitudes, different skills. We don't all enter this world with the same chances. Where you're born can have a huge impact on your chances in life, on your progress in life. If you are born into a culture that really values literacy, learning, books, and that sort of thing, and you live in a society where those types of skills are rewarded, then you're going to be in a much better situation than if you come out of a culture in the same society that does not value those things. And so we are products of our culture, and all cultures are not the same. Again, that does not mean that a culture is set in stone, but when you look around the world at various groups, you often, it is not uncommon to see a group that started out down here and that has ultimately risen up here, notwithstanding the fact that that group has faced discrimination, faced race, been treated as a second, third class citizen, and so forth. It's just not uncommon. In America, for example, among the highest achieving groups are Asian Americans, particularly Chinese and Japanese Americans. In America, the Chinese were lynched. The Japanese Americans were put in internment camps during World War II. There were limits on land ownership for Asians. They were put in separate school systems. And yet today, Asian Americans outperform white Americans, both academically and economically, and have for decades. So a group that has started out down here, faced all kinds of discrimination, has nevertheless managed to lift itself to prosperity. And that is not an example limited to the United States or to Asian Americans. You can look at Jews in any number of countries around the world where they were subject to discriminatory policies. You can look at ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, who again outperform other people in society, notwithstanding the fact that they face all kinds of limitations. So again, we are sometimes quick to assume that discriminatory policies are blanket explanations for outcomes in life. But that is not what we see when we look at society after society.
What does that say about Black America? Because I believe they're often not performing as well as other groups.
They're not, and I think that today we are too quick in American society, in particular, to assume that those racial disparities are a result of discrimination, when in fact I think that those disparities have much more to do with a lack of cultural development in some areas of the Black community, an underdevelopment that has not taken place. And the reason, ironically, I think in many cases it hasn't taken place is because of policies that have been put in place to help Blacks. In other words, expansions of the welfare state intended to reduce income inequality have made Blacks more dependent on government. They've damaged the work ethic within some aspects of the Black community. So these are well-intentioned policies, but they have wound up subsidizing harmful behaviors that I think have held blacks back far more than any discrimination has held them
or legacy of slavery, for
or
example.
legacy of slavery, yes.
I've heard people say that the breakdown of marriages is a crucial factor.
Yes, exactly, and that's a very good example of the use of discrimination as an all-purpose explanation. If you go back to the 1920s, the 1930s, black marriage rates in America were higher than white marriage rates.
There you are.
And yet, of course, the 1920s and the 1930s, we're talking about blacks who were only 1 or 2 generations removed from slavery, which ended in 1865. So you fast forward from the 1920s and 30s into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you see much higher rates of family breakdown, single parenting, and so forth. Now, how can you attribute that to the legacy of slavery when you had better outcomes in the black family in the 1920s and 30s? Yet that is what is commonly done. I'll give you another statistic that sort of undermines this legacy of slavery argument. Black poverty in America is usually about 1/3 higher than white poverty.
Right.
But among black married couples, the poverty rate in America is in the single digits. So what is driving poverty in America? Is it discrimination and the legacy of slavery, or is it attitudes towards marriage in the black community?
There you are.
Yet that is a question that is seldom asked when we are discussing what is driving poverty in black America. Because, of course, it's seen as blaming the victim, and so people shy away from cultural explanations of racial disparities and jump very quickly to this must be something that someone is doing or that society is doing to black people. This can't at all reflect the behavior of blacks.
Now, the reason you're a conservative in the sense of you believe in a lesser role for government, you've shown me what's wrong. You've said that many explanations for government involvement are unhelpful, in fact, counterproductive at times, some of the government outcome. What's the positive reason why you believe in a smaller government?
Well, I like to look at history and data. I take a more empirical approach to looking at what has worked and what has not worked. And in my reading of the history of blacks in America, I saw much faster progress when the government was playing a much smaller role. So if you go back to the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s, you saw blacks increasing their levels of income at faster rates than whites. You saw black incomes rising at faster rates than whites.
Is this the South or the North? Is it?
This is all across the country.
Despite Jim Crow?
Despite Jim Crow, despite much more racial discrimination in society and attitudes than you have today, you saw faster black progress than you've seen in more recent decades. And that tells me that that a lot of the programs put in place to help blacks have been interfering with that internal self-development that I think needs to take place. In other words, I think culture, human capital, attitudes, habits, behaviors are far more important in the advancement of a racial or ethnic minority group than special consideration or special treatment by the government. And unfortunately in America, the liberals take...
Your kind of liberals, yes.
My
progressives, yes.
My definition of liberals, the progressives, take exactly the opposite approach. And so among a lot of liberal elites, among a lot of ethnic leaders, what you see is an attempt to turn to the government to put in place special programs to help blacks. I see those special programs as barriers in and of themselves because of the incentives that those programs put in place.
Does religion play a role at all?
I think religion has historically played a role, an important role in a number of ways, in in helping racial and ethnic minority groups rise. You can point to the example of the rise of Irish Americans in America, for example, after immigrating there, starting in large numbers in the mid-1800s, in the mid-19th century. The Catholic Church in particular played a huge role in assimilating new immigrants, building hospitals, building schools, highlighting the importance of hygiene and things like that. And that was a very important legacy. Similarly, the black church has historically played a very, very important role, particularly in the civil rights movement
Yes, I was thinking of that.
of the mid-20th century. So yes, and to this day, the church, the black church, is one of the few viable institutions remaining in some of the poorest inner city black communities in America. So yes, the church can play a role. In my reporting, when I do speak to ministers, however, one of the complaints they have is that they tell me the pews are full of women and they want to reach the men. And that is one of the problems, the challenges that the black church is having.
Yes, I could imagine that's being true. I can imagine it being true. You also have a view, I believe, that you're a believer in the value of immigration in a society.
Well, yes, I do think that immigrants, particularly in America, and that is the immigration system I'm most familiar with, have traditionally played a positive role. Now, I understand that, again, trade-offs are involved in immigration. All immigrants are not playing a positive role, but neither are all immigrants playing a negative role. And I think on balance, immigrants have been net contributors, not only economically to America, but primarily economically, in the sense that they have helped to revitalize the population. As you know, immigrants are self-selecting, and an immigration system that allows people to come and to participate in freely in our labor markets in particular, and pursue their own interest. I think they're helping the country as a whole, and I think that is what immigrants have tended to do in America. Even the low-skill ones, even the poor ones who come in search of a better life, I think manage to do better for themselves, but also make important contributions to the country. And so I am someone who has generally supported more open immigration policies, notwithstanding the fact, again, that there can be a downside to this. And so we have to acknowledge that there are pros and cons to immigration, but on net, I think they've been a good thing for America.
Given your emphasis on culture and institutions, and the fact that you're saying that you believe the black community has declined in effect in the last few decades, what hope is there for change? If it's not going to be more government policies or reparations or what is the way to bring about a better outcome for blacks in America?
Generally, and we've seen this in recent years as well, generally black Americans have tended to do better economically when the economy is growing, when there are tight labor markets, and when they have access to those labor markets. And that's what we've had in America for some time now, the better part of the past decade, in fact. And blacks have been taking advantage of that. You've had record low unemployment rates. You've had record low poverty levels. Under the previous administration, under Donald Trump, prior to COVID, we had a period where black wages were rising at a faster rate than white wages.
This all comes as a surprise to me. The image I have is the opposite.
Yeah. Well, it's not something the media particularly like to highlight, particularly under Trump, because they were dead set against his presidency and didn't want to give him, credit for anything.
The whole Black Lives Matter movement painted a picture which is dark and dour.
It's good that you mentioned that. What you've had, I would argue, in America since the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s is a black leadership that has turned that movement into an industry, if not a racket. Right. And they raise money, they stay relevant, by pretending that nothing has really changed in America for blacks since the 1950s and 60s. For them, it's always 1950 in America because that's how the activists raise money. That's how some members of the Democratic Party get their voters to the polls, by pretending that all of the problems that blacks face are due to structural racism or unconscious bias or the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. And so you will always have this element of the black leadership out there selling this line to black Americans, notwithstanding the fact that a tremendous amount of change has taken place, and notwithstanding the fact that the civil rights movement, the civil rights battles were fought and won a long time ago by the right side.
Yes, yes.
and that is now incumbent for blacks to take advantage of those victories. And there are things that the government cannot do for black people that only blacks can do for themselves, and this civil rights leadership out there today doesn't want to acknowledge that because it will only diminish their relevance.
Wouldn't I be right in saying, if on what you've been telling me, that in fact not only does it not help, it actually hinders?
Oh, absolutely.
The victim mentality prevents the very change that you think is crucial.
And I can give you a good example of that, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement, because their major focus has been policing.
Yes, yes.
Law enforcement. And their argument is that essentially police pick on black people. And that is the reason we have racial disparities in America, is because the police are picking on us. They use phrases like blacks are incarcerated at a higher rate than whites. They don't talk about blacks committing crimes at higher rates than whites, which would explain the incarceration rates. I mean, in other words, men are incarcerated at higher rates than women.
Correct.
Young people are incarcerated at higher rates than older people. No one attributes this to bias in the system. We attribute it to the fact that young men disproportionately commit crime, particularly violent crimes. And so it is the case among blacks in America, where you have a disproportionate number of young black men committing crime, and the Black Lives Matter movement refusing to acknowledge that situation and deal with it, instead focusing on police behavior and pretending that the biggest problem in these black communities is the police rather than the criminals. And the problem with doing that, when you scapegoat law enforcement, you affect the quality of law enforcement in these communities. Police are much less reluctant to get out of their vehicles, to engage with the public. They are much more hesitant to do proactive policing that we know is the most effective policing. And all that does is make these black communities much more dangerous, because the criminals now have the run of the place. And black criminals, as criminals of all races do, tend to prey first and foremost on their neighbors.
Yes.
And so
yes.
To the extent that you are scapegoating police, you are going to promote less effective policing, which is only going to hurt the law-abiding members of these black communities, who are most of the members of these black communities. So the efforts of the Black Lives Matter movement to target police is only hurting the black community writ large. And that's a perfect example of a civil rights movement being completely out of touch with the needs of everyday blacks. Because if you do polls, and there have been plenty of polls done of black people who live in these communities, and ask them, do you want less policing in your community? They say, absolutely not. We want more policing. And yet you have a black leadership out there calling for less policing. And there you see this disconnect.
And
between the
also
leadership
white fellow travellers who are interested.
Yeah.
I mean, the Black Lives Movement is very much a white movement as well. Question about you personally. Have you always held these weird views?
I guess to some extent, I have. I mean, as a child.
What I'm asking is, why are you not like the other parts of the black leadership?
Well, that's a good question. I guess in terms of my upbringing, I wasn't raised in a particularly political household. I mean, we didn't sit around the dinner table at night discussing politics in my family, but I was raised in a deeply religious household. So there was a sort of social conservatism there, and there was also an emphasis on personal responsibility and personal behavior being a big deal. That was something my parents instilled in me and my siblings at a very young age. So I guess it might have started there. I wasn't raised to blame my problems on other people. I wasn't taught to do that from my parents. And in college, is when I really started to become a little more political. I worked on the school newspaper and discovered some writers like Thomas Sowell. I've written a book about Thomas Sowell, but there are other black academics, particularly economists. Glenn Loury was another one. Another race scholar named Shelby Steele comes to mind. I discovered a half dozen or so of these individuals when I was in college, and they sort of, while I was already somewhat thinking like them, they sort of gave me the vocabulary to express myself that I didn't have, and they had a much more systematic way of thinking about these issues, and I gleaned a lot from that, and those individuals had a huge impact on my journalism and my thinking going forward from
In fact,
there.
you both made a film about Thomas Sowell and written a book about Thomas Sowell.
I did. In addition to writing the biography of Sowell, I narrated a documentary film about him, and I was happy to do that. I mean, Sowell is 93 years old now. He turned 93 in June, and one of the goals of writing the book and doing the documentary was to sort of introduce him to a younger demographic, and because the documentary film has been streamed on places like Amazon, they can track who's watching it, and I've been pleased to learn that a younger cohort of viewers has been attracted to Thomas Sowell, so I've sort of reached a group that I was really hoping to with that film.
As our time together comes toward the end, I want to ask you the question about the future. Are you optimistic about the future, given it seems to me the fact that your views are very much still minority views amongst the black, and amongst many people, in fact?
Well, yes and no. I mean, one reason in the short run that I'm not particularly optimistic is because in America right now, the progressive left is very much ascendant. You have a lot of young socialist thinkers, Marxist thinkers that have really captured the imagination of a lot of young people in America right now, even more so than usual. Young people have always sort of tended to start on the left, and as they get older and experience life a little more, moved a little more to the right. But when I look at our politics in the U.S. right now, the wing of the Democratic Party that has been gaining the most momentum in recent years is that more progressive wing. And there are also a number of black progressives that have gained a lot of prominence in the United States over the past 5 to 10 years. And so in the short run, I'm not optimistic.
Why
I think
is that?
we feel that I have our work cut out. Because they've gained so much attention. They're writing books that are being read, widely cited. We have the most pernicious aspect of this has been that America's most prominent newspaper, the New York Times, has started a project to try and rewrite American history. It's called the 1619 Project, and 1619 was the year that the first blacks arrived in America, and so they've labeled it the 1619
As enslaved people?
Well, there's some debate about whether they were enslaved or indentured servants. The first who came, many historians believe that they weren't enslaved.
Right.
They weren't slaves. They were indentured servants. Later, arrivals became slaves. But in any case, there is some agreement that the first blacks to come were 1619. And in any case, the point of this...
The cultural swing you're saying is towards the progressive still, strongly.
It's toward the progressive still, and it's and this particular project is trying to reframe U.S. history and place slavery at the center of it, and it's gained a lot of momentum. In other words, this group is saying that what makes America unique is its slave past, and some of us on the other side say, no, that is not what makes America unique. Slavery has existed, through societies all over the world, thousands of years before the creation of America. What makes America unique is emancipation, not slavery. It's how fast we went from slavery to a Martin Luther King, to a black president. That's what makes America unique. And yet there's a move to center slavery.
You said short-term pessimistic. Are you long-term optimistic then?
Well, I
mean,
I am.
Let me put it this way: if you're right, and I think you are, these solutions that are being offered by the progressives will not work.
They
therefore
won't work.
But there come a time to say, well, we're still no better. Maybe something else.
That is one reason.
It will take a generation.
Maybe not that long, but that is one reason to be optimistic. That simply these policies don't work, and they obviously don't work, and so people will be looking for something else. Another reason to be somewhat optimistic is that I think the progressive pendulum has swung too far. In other words, we are having conversations in America right now where people are calling math racist, where people are calling punctuality white supremacy. We're having conversations where people who swam on the boys' team last year are swimming on the girls' team this year, winning all the races, and no one is allowed to notice. And I think for the average American, that is a bit much. I think we are tearing down statues of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and erecting statues of George Floyd. And I think that, for many Americans, is a bridge too far.
Overreach.
And so that is one reason that I'm optimistic that people will say enough of this nonsense.
Jason Riley, thank you very much. I'll be speaking with Jason Riley from the New York, I'm going to go back to put you in New York Times. That would be a terrible thing to say.
Terrible thing
from the Wall Street Journal.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has been another in the series Liberalism in Question. I'm Rob Forsyth. Thanks for watching.